Well, hello, Trinity Baptist. This is the pre-recorded message for Sunday, January the 9th, 2022. That's right, we are in the new year, and I trust you're well. We're going to continue on in our series on Genesis in the coming weeks. We've just finished Genesis chapters 1 to 11, which has been providing for us what I believe is a rich foundation for a biblical worldview, from everything from teaching on the beginnings of things and what we're made for and what we're made of to answering the question, well, what's gone wrong with the world? Why is it the way it is? Well, today I thought what we would do is kind of hit pause a little bit on the teaching. We're not going to move into chapter 12 quite yet. I wanted to take a little bit of time to apply some of our learning. One of the benefits of being on Zoom is that it's an interactive platform. And so if you are watching this, you missed our Zoom, or perhaps this is review for you, but what we're going to be doing is spending some time on Sunday morning just kind of interacting on some of the current world views that we struggle with in Canada. And we're going to pass those worldviews through Genesis 1 to 11 and see kind of how they hold up against a biblical worldview. For this recording, you can definitely hit pause at any point and take time to reflect on that, and I will be sharing some questions halfway through where you can kind of hit pause and maybe do some reflection. Okay, so what's our topic today? What's the worldview that we're going to be assessing? Well, I thought it would be great to talk about what is called the sacred secular split, or the sacred secular divide. What is that? What's the sacred secular split? Well, let's talk about the terms for a moment. The word sacred, I'm sure you know what the word sacred means. It's kind of generally means things that are religious or of a religious nature, things that are gods or dedicated to God. So when you think of things that are sacred, you might think of things like churches, temples, sacred sites, maybe certain people, priests or preachers. Maybe you think I'm a pretty sacred dude. Maybe missionaries or missions. You might think of things like seminaries or Christian schools. You might think of certain holy books, the Bible, or maybe other religions, maybe the Quran. So these are the things that we maybe think of when we think of the word sacred. Secular. Secular would, I guess, then be the opposite. It would be anything that's non-religious or non-spiritual. Oftentimes we call music that's non-religious secular music because it's not religious in nature. Or we might call schools secular if they aren't religious schools. Or we consider government to be secular because we don't want our governments to be sort of affiliated with this particular religion. So things like that. So those are sort of our concepts for the words sacred and secular. So what's this sacred secular split? Well, it's this pervasive idea in Western societies that there should be a separation between religious matters and non-religious matters. One area that would be very common and most would agree on is the separation of church and state. That the state shouldn't have undue influence over the church, and the church shouldn't have too much influence on the state. Now, the idea of the secular realm is actually a more recent human construction, and it was born during a time historically we call the Enlightenment period in Europe. Most cultures actually historically don't have the concept of secular until it was sort of born in the period of the 1700s during the Enlightenment in Europe. In fact, the idea of secular has been sort of kind of become globalized or has become well known around the world because of European colonialism. But before the Enlightenment, kings and emperors were either appointed by God or by the gods, or they were even considered to be gods themselves. Roman emperors were kind of considered as gods, small g gods, and you would even sacrifice or make offerings to the Roman emperors. This is obviously before Constantine. Um, so government wasn't considered secular back in the day. Neither were things like farming. Farming was a very religious thing because it's the gods who brought the right proportions of rain and sun, and so you had to sacrifice to the gods if you were part of a pagan culture, or if you were a Christian, you would pray, or you would seek God for His provision of these things. Even trade, merchants in Roman times were part of trade guilds, and they had patron gods that they would sacrifice to. So absolutely everything before the Enlightenment was religious. It was sort of like there was not a sacred secular split. They did have a different category to sacred back in those times, but that other category would have been called profane or unclean. Things that were not of God or not sacred were considered profane or unclean. And profane or unclean were things, generally speaking, that you wanted to stay away from. Things that could harm your soul or bad for society, things that were taboo. In fact, a lot of the Old Testament is written to keep the people of God, from participating in things that God says will harm their relationship with one another and with Him, things that are profane or unclean. But during the Enlightenment, a new idea emerged, an idea we now call deism, Deism. Deism was this idea that there's this material world that God made, but God kind of put the material world or the created world under natural laws. And kind of like a watchmaker, God kind of assembled the natural world, He wound it up, and then He just kind of set it in motion and kind of walked away from His created order. In other words, God created the world in such a way where the world doesn't require God to continue to function. He created these natural laws to govern the day-to-day functioning of the universe. So God is presently uninvolved, was kind of the idea. And so all of a sudden, because this idea that there were things that God made but weren't necessarily gods, they weren't bad, but God wasn't really involved in them. There kind of emerged this new category, a neutral category. It wasn't just like there were things that were good and bad. There were things that were kind of neutral. There wasn't just things that were sacred or profane. There were things that were secular, and so that's where this idea emerged. And so you could have things like social systems, government, schools, police, army, things that were non-religious, and yet they were kind of neutral. They weren't bad. Another thing that contributed to the growth of this idea of secular, or the category of secular, was the Reformation of the church in the 1700s. And it was the idea that the Christian faith was more personal, and there was sort of a movement towards a personal faith and away from seeing the Christian faith as a completely corporate or society-wide institution. all of a sudden you couldn't assume everybody around you was a Christian just because they grew up with you, because they were baptized as an infant. Europe moved more and more away from that idea and more into this idea that in order for faith to be meaningful, it needed to be chosen, and faith needed to be a personal experience. And so more and more people began to identify outside the category of Christian. And so these new categories needed to emerge. So you weren't a Christian, but you weren't evil. So you became sort of a secular person. Um, and, during this period of time, Europe kind of over time democratized, kind of rejected the idea that kings were God's appointed servants, and more of society became secularized. Church and state became separate institutions. And what we can kind of see is that the secular category increased and the sacred category decreased. And more things kind of slid into the category of the secular. Some examples would be, like, for instance, law. Used to be in Europe, even in North America, that the Bible and the Ten Commandments were kind of like the foundation of the law courts or the law system. But more and more today, laws are moving away from the Bible or a biblical worldview being the basis for laws. And government has kind of gone the same direction. Things like hospitals, universities, they used to be church-run institutions, but more and more those institutions are moving into identifying as secular. Um, I think most of the Ivy League schools in America started out training pastors for ministry. And you can see that most of those today are very, very far from a biblical worldview. Um, in our Canadian context today, the Christian faith is generally relegated to overtly religious institutions like churches and church denominations and mission organizations. And Christians who aren't in overtly religious roles are generally expected to keep their faith personal and private. It's actually quite sad because a lot of people who are passionate about their Christian faith often feel at a loss how to express their faith in a way that's holistic, or they can engage all of their lives in their faith. And so many feel a pressure in order for them to express their faith more wholly, they feel a pressure into going into full-time ministry in order because that's what the really serious or the really spiritual Christians do. Um, excuse me. Another thing that's occurred because of the secular sacred split is that Christians have ended up with compartmentalized lives. Um, Sort of like there's things that are of God or are religious in nature, and then there are things that are neutral, and then there's the bad stuff. So and kind of like there's things that move in and out of those categories depending on what church you go to or who you associate with, and so it's a really tricky um, time to be a Christian and to know kind of what belongs in what category. I mean, we know, things like watching porn or being an alcoholic or having a drug addiction. These are clearly bad things. We shouldn't, as Christians, participate in them. And we know that there are certain things that we ought to do, but there's this whole sort of area of neutral activities where we're like, well, should we do these things or not? And then, of course, there's the workplace. The workplace is in this, generally speaking, in the secular category. And well, what if at my work, my boss asks me to do things that go against my religious conscience? Is the world right in assuming that I should just leave my Christian ethics in my personal private life? when I go to work, do I kind of check that at the door and do what I'm told? Or how does that work? Am I allowed to abstain from certain things in the world because of my religious conscience? So these are some of the really tough questions that we're navigating these days as to according to the biblical worldview versus the sacred secular split. All right. So I'm going to send you into the time of reflection now. I'm going to read a few questions and then just encourage you to spend some time reflecting personally on this whole area of the sacred secular split. So here we go. Take some time to reflect on your understanding of the sacred secular split, and how do you struggle with expressing your faith in non-Christian contexts like your workplace? Maybe you're in university, maybe you're in public school, maybe your kids are in public school, maybe in your friendships with unbelievers, perhaps relating to unbelieving family, media consumption, in all these different areas. How do you struggle with expressing your faith in these kind of secular areas? Take some time to reflect on that now. You can hit pause. Secondly, how does our understanding of the sacred secular split frustrate our longings to serve God in different spheres of our lives? For instance, for example, is being a stay-at-home parent calling? Can it be something we can do fully for God? Can you serve God wholly in the marketplace or at your secular workplace? What does it look like for you to be a retiree in the world that we're living in that's rapidly changing in its values? Why don't you hit pause and reflect on that question? And lastly, number 3, what pressures are you experiencing personally in this Canadian context to adopt a different value system than what we find in the Bible? Take some time to reflect on that. Okay, so let's take a look at a Genesis 1 to 11 worldview. Let's take this sacred secular split and pass it through the filter of God's Word, and let's see what happens. According to Genesis 1 to 11, what is sacred? Well, you might say everything. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see that the scriptures make a strong case that everything is God's. Everything. Genesis 1 is comprehensive. The heavens and the earth and everything in the earth is made by God. And God looks at everything, and what does He say? He says everything is good. Before Genesis 3, in fact, there's nothing that is not good. There's nothing that's bad or evil. And so God doesn't create things with different categories. Things that are His or not His, things that are good and bad or neutral. God kind of has one category He creates things in, and it's called good. And the rest of the Bible kind of reiterates this, even after Genesis 3 and sin entering the picture. Excuse me. Let me read you a few scriptures to reflect on. Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's. Did you hear that? The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. So the earth and everything in it, people, like everybody, we all belong to God. Romans 11:36. For from Him and through Him and for Him are, listen, all things. To Him be glory forever. Amen. So all things are from Him, are to be done through Him, and are for Him. Wow. And lastly, 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whatever you do, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So everything is to be done for Him. And so according to this understanding, God did not intend to create a human existence in which some things are God's and some things aren't, where we have some things that are religious and some things that are kind of non-religious or neutral. No, in a Genesis 1 to 11 worldview, all things are God's. Okay, so what about this idea of the category of profane or unclean? Does Genesis 1 to 11 give us an understanding for that which isn't good, that which is maybe evil or bad? Well, of course. From Genesis 3 to the rest up to 11, we see that there's a lot of time spent kind of unpacking that which is profane or unclean or wrong or bad or whatever term you want to use there. And in Genesis, in the Genesis 1 to 11 worldview, we see that there is a concept. The term free will isn't used, but the idea of us having choice or agency or free will is kind of presented as in the context of that which is good and bad. Humans are created to choose to live according to God's will, but we are given the freedom to choose not to live according to God's will. This is the idea of free will. So how does Genesis describe free will? Well, we've taught into this, but I'll just quickly review. Genesis 1 and 2 describes that we were created in His image, and a big part of who God is that He is free to make decisions according to His character. And so too we are free. We've been given free human agency. We're free to choose things. And God put a lot of choices in front of Adam and Eve. He put them in a garden with tons of trees to choose from for food, tons of different options for work. We see Adam naming the animals. He had a lot of choices of what he could name things and do. So according to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, there's lots of decisions that aren't moral decisions. They're not a decision between a good choice and a bad choice. They're a decision between many good choices. And because God has made making those decisions good, all those choices are sacred. They're good choices. And even today, there are a lot of choices we can make that aren't choices between a good choice and a bad choice. And so all the choices that we can make that God's given us that aren't moral decisions, or aren't a decision between God's will or not God's will, these we would consider sacred, or the Bible would consider sacred. God made you free because God made you this way. It is sacred. He made you free to make those good choices. If all good choices come from God and can be exercised for His glory, then according to this way of thinking, there is no such thing as a secular decision or a non-religious decision. For a person to live according to how God intended, we would see all categories as activities that are belonging to God. Our vocation, education, family life, our possessions, our leisure, even our sex lives. Yes, it is all His and can be lived out for His glory and with fullness, the fullness of God in mind. However, free will isn't completely free unless we have the freedom to choose something other than God. And Genesis actually gives us that concept as well. In Genesis 2, we see that God has put two trees in the garden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One they were permitted to eat of, and one they were not. And so, of course, even the name of that second tree is telling. It's clear that in making the decision to disobey God, His explicit command to them, Adam and Eve are exerting their will in deciding what is right and wrong. In other words, God, no thank you. We are going to decide for ourselves what is good. We will construct our own moral code. We'll construct our own understanding, our own knowledge of what is good and what is wrong. And so from this perspective, that which is profane or not of God are those things that we choose as free human beings that are outside God's will or go against God's explicit commandments. Again, there's lots of scriptures that reiterate this. Proverbs 14:12, it says this, there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. And then Isaiah 64, verse 6, all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous acts are like filthy rags. We all shrivel up like a leaf, and like the wind, our sins sweep us away. And so, according to the scriptures in this Genesis 1 to 11 worldview, there is no third category. There is no neutral, non-religious area called the secular. So, what do we do? What do we do with this concept of the secular world? Well, I would suggest to you this morning that Genesis does introduce a concept that comes close to describing the secular in describing what we would call the world. And that idea or that concept is introduced in the story of the Tower of Babel. We talked about that on the 26th of December, so feel free to go back and listen to that message. But that concept of the world is really kind of presented in Genesis 11. This story of the Tower of Babel, just a quick review, it illustrated the world's capacity to coordinate our combined efforts as human beings to create a godless society. If you recall in the story, the ancestors of Noah disobeyed God's command to fill the earth and to spread out. Rather, they say, no, we're gonna settle in this plain. We're gonna build this city. We're gonna build this tower with these bricks. And God ends up. Oh, by the way, they say the reason that they give is that they won't be scattered over the world. So they're clearly disobeying God. And secondly, they want to make a name for themselves. So no longer are they living for the glory of God, but they're living for themselves. Excuse me. So you could argue that this is kind of the first attempt at building a secular or civic world outside of God's will. Saying, God, yeah, we don't want any religion. We want to build our society around just us human beings. This is a human-only club. God, no gods allowed here, or no God allowed here, at least. We'll make gods, but we'll make them in our own image, kind of thing. But how does God respond to the building of this city and this tower? Does he consider anything godless or neutral? Well, no. No, God knows that those things we do that seem good to us, they turn out for evil. Everything we do sort of outside of his will ultimately brings death and destruction. Because, simply put, there is only one life giver. The only one who can bring life is God himself. And so all that we do ends up leading to death and destruction. Okay. So if we don't really have a category in this biblical 1 to 11 worldview for secular, if we only have that which is sacred and that which is profane, how do we live in a world that sees everything in categories of secular and sacred, or religious and non-religious? Well, Paul Williams, in his book Exiles on Mission, tackles this question. And he points out that followers of Christ today in North America really struggle with this. And we struggle to kind of struggle with one of two directions. Either we tend to assimilate into a secular worldview, or we end up withdrawing. That is, either we slowly adopt the values of the dominant culture and try to fit into the expectations of those around us, those in our workplace, our government, maybe our unbelieving family and friends, or we withdraw. We create ghettos or echo chambers or monastic communities where we can preserve our religious identity. While Williams argues for a third way, and I think it's biblical, and it's this, he presents this idea that we are to live as a community in exile. This idea that we are aliens or displaced persons living in a land we don't possess is an idea that emerges over and over again in the New Testament. In fact, Jesus, in his prayer in John 17, this is what he prays for his followers, his disciples. He says to the Father, "They are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world." So Jesus in this prayer acknowledges here that we are not a part of the secular world or the world system. And so as a result of that, we need to resist assimilating or over-identifying with the world. Yet, having said that, he also refuses to take us out of the world. In fact, he sends us into the world as his representatives to continue his work there. Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:19, he says it this way. He says, "He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us." So we're kind of sent as foreigners into the world to be representatives of God, ambassadors, ministers of reconciliation. Whew. So I think I'm going to end there. I hope this was a helpful exercise as you're working through this secular sacred split. What the purpose of this exercise was that we would be able to strengthen in order to maintain a biblical worldview and to be able to live out our Christian life faithfully before God. Part of our passion for teaching through the book of Genesis is to be sure that we've laid a proper foundation biblically so that you can navigate some of the complexities that you're facing. This is never before have we experienced such complexity, such difficulty in living out our Christian faith. And so I'd love your feedback. Feel free to give me an email or give me a text and let me know if there's other ways that we can work towards kind of re-engaging in a biblical worldview. All right, God bless.